Hello everyone, good morning. Welcome to Gwent, the Witcher card game. My name is Rooster and we are looking at the second update to the closed beta, which is expected to be released sometime soon, which we're expecting to be sometime early next week. So I'm expecting it to drop on Tuesday personally. Could be sooner, could be a little later, but we should be looking at it pretty soon, and it is going to be quite the update. Developers have mentioned that about 140 cards are changed. That is a lot of stuff that's going to be different, as well as some basic gameplay changes. Many of these updates are going to be small tweaks, like strength increases or decreases, timers that have been changed, and not all of these are that important to talk about, and many of them are, as of yet, still unknown because no patch notes have been released yet. But in the developer stream that was happening last night, we did get to see, well, at least the most important changes, as well as quite a number of other ones. So I would like to highlight the most important things over here, and talk a little bit about what's going to happen with the game after the next patch, which they've also given us a sneak peek of. So without further ado, let's get going and let's take a look at the game mechanics that are going to be changed first. So first of all, let's talk about promotion. This is changed a little bit, mostly to prevent the tactic that is really frustrating to play against, especially as a newer player, of buffing a certain unit into infinity and then either having that unit be something very resilient, such as a roach or an Olgierd, that tends to come back by itself every turn, or buffing a unit and then adrenaline rushing it. And while that last tactic has not entirely been nerfed to the ground by this, it will at least be easier to deal with than before, I think. Although, come to think of it, if you buff a unit into infinity and then adrenaline rush it to keep it until the next round, then you're likely to win that round, which means you're going first and then you can just promote it the next round. That may not be what was intended, but we'll have to see how that turns out, at the very least. So yeah, promoted units with adrenaline rush, that might still be a tactic that kind of works, but it is still very much based on your opponent passing early in the round and basically having multiple actions in quick succession without your opponent interfering. So as long as you don't let your Northern Realms opponent pass, well, as long as you don't pass early against your Northern Realms opponent, we should be reasonably fine with it. The main thing that is changed here is that units that return each round no longer have their base strength set to whatever the temporary increased strength was at the moment of promotion, because promotion is now removed, which means that that any temporary effects that buff the unit's strength are also removed at the end of the round, which means that Roach generally returns to a 3 strength unit at the end of the round again, and Olgierd normally returns as a 6 and then reduces his own base strength by 2. So the really frustrating tactic here is going to be nerfed to the ground, and probably for the best. I've played a little bit with at the very least promoting Olgierd, and that is a really frustrating thing to play against. Second, there are 3 new keywords that have been added. Well, permadeath is the first one, and it may sound like a new keyword, but basically it just replaces the medic tag that a certain number of minions had, usually minions that resurrect other minions, and to prevent the ubiquitous medic chaining, medics were given the tag medic, and then their resurrect ability signified that medics cannot resurrect other medics. Now, medic is no longer a thing. Well, people can still refer to units that resurrect other units as medics, and that will probably remain game slang for quite a bit. But any medics will now have the permadeath tag, which means that they cannot be resurrected by most other effects. Certain cards like Sigurd Riva and also the Restoration special card will still be able to resurrect units with permadeath. Permadeath card will still be in your graveyard to count for effects like Madmen, Lugos, and they can still be absorbed by certain monsters. But the main thing to take away from this is that permadeath can also be applied to units that are not necessarily medics, but instead just units that you don't want to be resurrected over and over again. So a bit more broadly applicable, I guess, and that's probably a good thing. So examples of units with permadeath are Sigurd Riva herself and also Shani. Common tactic might be to degrade Shani into a silver unit and then keep resurrecting her to get gold units out of your graveyard. That's pretty nice, but won't be possible anymore. Of course, cards with permadeath are not necessarily limited to the cards shown here. These are just examples. Another new keyword is fleeting, which basically attempts to do the same thing, but mostly for special cards. Also, a couple of minions have fleeting. A card with fleeting is removed from the game after it has either been played as a special card or when it has been played as a unit. So when a unit with fleeting is removed from the battlefield, it is removed from the game. It does not go to the graveyard. And that is mostly to prevent the endless recursion of certain effects. For example, Commander's Horn was used and reused over and over again in certain Scoia'tael decks. The same applies to Nature's Gift. There we go. Sometimes card names are hard to remember, especially if you don't own the cards yourself. And finally, the keyword Relentless applies to units with powerful abilities that trigger when they are played, and that are not intended to be used over and over again. So kind of in the same vein as the other two keywords, but Relentless simply signifies that a unit cannot be removed from the battlefield except by being destroyed. So that prevents the unit from being returned to its owner's hand, for example, by the card Decoy, but certain Scoia'tael effects can also trigger this. So mostly anti-Scoia'tael, but can apply to certain other factions also. Examples of cards with Relentless are Operator, Johnny, and it was rumored that Aglaïs, I'm butchering these names and I'm terribly sorry, but that she was also gaining the Relentless keyword. That is, however, not the case, so don't worry, Scoia'tael hasn't been completely nerfed to the ground. You can still recur your Aglaïs, especially with the Scoia'tael leader, as oftentimes as you wish. Do remember that the names of these keywords aren't necessarily final. They may change to something more appropriate. I don't really like the name permadeath. It does cover what it's meant to do. It just doesn't really feel like it should be a keyword. So there might be some name changes, and many other cards, of course, may have the keywords. They just haven't been shown as having those keywords yet. And also a thing to remember is that, for example, some cards may have the fleeting mechanic, yet there really isn't much of a reason for them to have that. But this can also be in anticipation of some new cards that are yet to be revealed. which wouldn't be possible if a certain special card would be able to recur over and over again. So this may open up some new design space, which is a term that is thrown around a lot in card game communities. But this does open up some design space for fancy new effects, which may not have been possible with certain cards remaining the same. Now, a mechanic that has not necessarily been touched directly is weather, and that's actually kind of surprising to some people, because weather is also one of those tactics that's pretty frustrating to play against, especially as a newer player. However, indirectly, this mechanic has been touched pretty significantly by the changing of the Clear Weather card. The card is now named First Light, and it is a card that has two options. So you can either use Clear Weather as usual, so it basically adds another option to the card, and that option is Rally, which summons a random bronze unit from your deck. And that basically means that that the main disadvantage of the card Clear Weather is really alleviated. So the main problem with Clear Weather has always been that the card does absolutely nothing unless there's weather in play. So the main counter to weather decks was Clear Weather, or I guess Demeritium Bomb, but Clear Weather is the main card that people flock towards when they're being oppressed by all these monster weather players. But if you're not playing against monster weather, then the card is going to be absolutely dead and can only be used for skipping a turn, basically. Now, however, you can just First Light and summon a random bronze unit. So that means that turns that would otherwise be absolutely dead can actually be constructive now. Of course, you do have to be a little careful, because summoning random bronze units might not be the most perfect play for the current turn. For example, summoning an archer unit when your opponent has no viable targets for it, summoning a Scoia'tael unit that plays a special card you may not have wanted. It's not necessarily ideal, but it's certainly a lot better than it used to be, and this makes running Clear Weather effects in your deck much less of a cost. So that is definitely a great change, in my opinion. It might be a little bit too good, but we'll have to see how it turns out, I guess. It's especially really good in Scoia'tael decks that tend to run a lot of special cards and tend to run, for example, some minions that play random special cards from your deck. I can't quite come up with the name, but I'm sure you catch my drift. If one of those minions would pull a Clear Weather, then it would have done absolutely nothing in the past, and now it can just summon an additional minion, which might even play an additional special card. So that's pretty great. Very playable in Scoia'tael decks, in my opinion, and even in monster decks, in Northern Realms decks, in pretty much every deck can benefit from running one or two Clear Weather effects, in my opinion. So that's pretty excellent. Of course, there may still be some better solutions to combating weather, but that is up to you, basically. You will always have the option to have anti-weather tech if you so desire. Next change, which is a bit more controversial, Stammelford's Tremors now removes 2 strength from all units and not just your opponents. So this is mostly a downside, of course, because you can no longer Tremors to basically no downside, just absolutely wrecking everything your opponent owns, especially effective against tactics that summon a lot of small minions, of course. But it can be a viable tactic to play the Tremors in a deck, for example, a Skellige deck that likes to damage its own minions. So there is some amount of upside. Mostly this is a nerf, and most non-Skellige decks, I think, would be more likely to now run Lacerate instead of Tremors, but we'll have to see how that works later. Mostly Scoia'tael decks will no longer run Tremors, I think, because poor Hawker supports. I will not even attempt to. Well, I'm going to attempt to do it anyway. There is Mirkta Braka. I think I'm pretty sure this is a buff. It used to reduce a unit by 2 strength, then a unit by 1 strength, and then again by 1 strength. But now removes 3, then 2, then 1 strength. So a lot more potent, I think. However, his strength has been reduced to 4 from 5. So a little less power on its own, but a lot more versatile. Now removes a total of 6 strength. Pretty powerful. Roach has received a small nerf and, of course, an indirect nerf in the form of the promote changes, but also no longer appears when your opponent plays a gold unit, only triggers when you yourself play a gold unit. So there's something to consider. You no longer have to be afraid to play your gold units in anticipation of your opponent's Roach coming out. So that's a relief, I guess. Also, you can no longer count on your Roach just appearing by itself. You really do have to play one of your own gold units for that to happen. Now, I said I wasn't going to cover small, relatively simple strength changes. I do think it's important to point out this change. Ciri, her strength has been reduced to 6 from 8, and this mostly needs to be pointed out because Ciri is one of the cards that new players tend to craft relatively early. She was really powerful. I do think she's still playable, but mostly to incentivize your opponent to pass first and foremost, because Ciri, as you may remember, returns herself to your hand if you lost the round in which you played her. This card is still pretty good, especially in Northern Realms decks, of course, in which her her strength counts twice, because well, you play a gold card and then the next round you play a gold card again, so the faction bonus triggers twice, I mean. But in other decks that care about card advantage and that do not really care about losing a round, they will still be interested in playing Ciri, I think. However, she is no longer a 100% auto-include, basically, especially if you're lacking other gold options. And that is probably a good thing. This may be a little much, I'm not quite sure, but I suspect that a reduction to 7 strength may not have been enough to make her no longer an auto-include, I mean. Another change that should be mentioned, even though it is actually quite a small change, Gerald Igni, also called Gigni by some, now only removes your opponent's strongest minions in a row when their total strength in that row is 20 instead of 15. So may make it a little easier to not overcommit into a row, because 15, you can get to 15 strength relatively easily in a row, which makes the old Gerald a little tough to play around. So it will be a little easier to not overextend and not reach the threshold of 20, which makes his power a little less, still a really strong card. So definitely not a bad first craft as your first legendary, in my opinion. And I have been lucky enough to open him in a booster, and definitely not sad about that at all. Now for faction cards, we first have to look at the monster passive ability. Received a small buff. Basically, the monster passive ability allows you to keep a random minion on the battlefield for the next round, and this now ignores minions that already persist until the next round. So mostly this applies to people playing Adrenaline Rush in monsters, which is not all that common, to be fair, but automatically ignoring minions with Adrenaline Rush might make the card better in monster, because that was a main reason not to include the card in a monster deck, because whenever the monster passive would trigger on a unit with Adrenaline Rush, that would feel really, really bad. So a small buff, not necessarily that impactful, but I feel it's worth mentioning. Now, the Drowner card was always a little bit of an oddball, I think, because it was basically just a 7-strength siege unit for the monsters with no abilities, and that really felt strange. The developers have said that some of those cards are placeholders, and now the Drowner has received an actual effect, so that's nice. Its strength has been reduced down to 5, but it now has immunity to rain, as well as the ability to move an enemy minion into their siege row. So that makes playing rain in a monster deck slightly more appealing, I think, and also gives you the ability to move an enemy minion into a row with rain, or perhaps even just the threat of playing rain into their siege row after moving a unit into it. Also, a thing that should be clarified is that when you move a unit into a row with weather affecting that row, then the weather will affect that unit, of course. Now, the technology wasn't necessarily there yet before this patch, but it should work as intended when the patch hits. Another card that I think is worth pointing out is Nithrol, which is one of the legendary silver cards that wasn't necessarily too impressive. His strength has been reduced from 7 to 6, but I think that's pretty important actually, because his new ability now deals 2 damage for every Wild Hunt unit spawned. Which is pretty darn impactful, especially with the Wild Hunt Riders, which means he can instantly deal 6 damage, divided randomly, of course. But makes him pretty dangerous to leave on the board, and having 6 health makes him a little bit, just that much easier to remove, and that is very necessary. So if people are flocking towards playing Nithrol, then playing 1 or 2 Alzur's Thunder in your deck becomes that much more appealing, I think. And finally, for the monster cards that have been changed, Dagon, whatever you want to call him, received a pretty significant buff, in my opinion, because he's now not only able to choose any of the 3 weather types to spawn onto both players' battlefields, but he can also choose to not only clear skies, but actually first light. So the changed Clear Skies card, which lets him summon a random bronze unit from his deck. So even in the situations where, for example, your opponent only plays weather immune units, and you don't necessarily have a need to spawn any of your own weather effects, you can just choose to summon a random bronze unit from your deck, which makes him a little bit more versatile and removes the really feel-bad moments where none of the weather effects is really that relevant, or you just really need a minion on the battlefield. So that's pretty good. Dagon is going to be pretty strong. So with the monster cards down, let's go to Northern Realms. First look at Dandelion, which is a little bit of an oddball. So his effect used to be a 1-strength minion that spawns and immediately plays a Commander's Horn, which of course doubles the strength of all units in a certain row. Now his strength is increased to 4, and he has a completely different effect, so no longer does anything with Commander's Horns, I'm sorry. While he is on the battlefield as a 4-strength unit, of course, he gives all units spawned +2 strength, which is a really strong effect, but do remember that this also counts for your opponent's minions. I keep calling units minions, I'm sorry. But this is a potentially really powerful, but also potentially really dangerous effect. For example, if your opponent happens to be running a spawner deck, a breeding deck, whatever, any tactic that involves spawning multiple units with a single card, is going to get a lot of benefit out of Dandelion. So not only your own cards, unfortunately. We'll have to see whether this card is worth playing, but it's certainly interesting. We also need to take a look at Red of It, which is kind of a boring change, but probably necessary. I'm not really sure how oppressive Red of It control decks were, but they were certainly popular and pretty frustrating to play against. So Red of It now only removes 8 strength, down from 10. Can still affect gold units, of course, but just a slight little nerf. Usually Red of It was used to get rid of Siri anyway, and he can still do that. But just a little less oppressive in the case of you playing huge ass minions, which is fine. We'll have to see. Red of It probably still worth playing in the decks that used to play him anyway. Taking a look at Skellige cards, another name that I will struggle to pronounce correctly, but Drake Bondu used to be pretty marginal, I think. A 2 strength minion that buffs the strength of all cards in your graveyard by 2. Now his own strength has been increased to 4, and he now affects base strength of cards in your graveyard, which is a pretty noticeable thing, because Skellige, of course, does care a lot about the base strength of their cards, because reanimating things over and over again is kind of their thing. But the bonus only is +1 right now instead of +2. So whether Drake is worth running remains yet to be seen, but certainly more worthwhile, because just buffing the strength of cards in your graveyard is kind of marginal. And finally, not actually finally, because 2 of the Skellige leaders have been changed. First, let's look at King Bran. Still discards 2 cards to search your deck for a specific card and put it into your hand, but a small buff that now affects the strength of cards that are discarded with this ability. So any units discarded with King Bran's ability now have their base strength increased by +2. And the main thing to note here is that I'm not sure what the name of the card is, excuse me, but the raiders that get resurrected when discarded are also affected by this. So they now have a very respectable 6 strength on the first turn, scaling up to 8 strength on the final turn, of course, taking into account the Skellige passive ability. Now, King Bran is not a very popular leader overall, but this may just give him that slight little edge that makes people more likely to try him out anyway. Another of the Skellige leaders... actually, let's take a look at Madman Lugos first. I should check my notes more often, I guess. Madman Lugos now only gains bonus strength based on the graveyard after 2 turns instead of immediately. So Madman Lugos always was this finisher for Skellige decks that you knew it was coming, because they cycled through their entire deck over the course of the game and then held onto that final card. And you saw it coming, and there was very little you could do about it, because they just played their Lugos, added like 20 strength to the board, and there was not really any interaction about it, except saving your Damaritium Bomb for right until they dropped their Lugos, and then on the final turn, you drop Lugos, they drop their bomb, and you're feeling sad. Now, however, there's a little bit more counterplay to it, because you need to play your Lugos earlier, because the strength he gains from your graveyard only triggers 2 turns later. Which gives your opponent a little bit more counterplay here, because they can use, for example, Triss to kill him. Well, that only really applies on the very first turn, in which you don't really want to play Lugos, I guess. But there are certain cards that can deal damage to gold cards. I guess you could demote him in a Northern Realms deck and then just kill him. There are ways around this, and you can also see it coming and perhaps eat cards out of your opponent's graveyard, or perhaps build your own board, because now your opponent can't really first time rich and bomb your board and then play Lugos. So a little bit more of a window for counterplay. We'll have to see whether Lugos is still good, whether he's better perhaps. We'll have to see. And the final Skellige leader we want to talk about is Harold the Cripple, who received a rather interesting update. So he used to remove 4 strength from every wounded opposing unit, but now he removes 3 strength instead, but now also removes 2 strength from non-wounded units on your opponent's side, and this even applies to gold units. So that's really interesting, and makes him more likely to run cards like Stumbleford Tremors, which may have been a little bit too strong if it weren't nerfed this patch. Really interesting. Whether it's better than just a regular Kraken crate remains to be seen, but definitely interesting, and I'm all in favor of interesting. Now finally, let's take a look at Gadgetzan, who has a lot of cards that are entirely reworked, so definitely worth taking a look at. First is Illiren. Let's not dwell on that too much. Anyway, Illiren used to destroy all of your commando neophytes and then deal damage to your opponent's board based on how many neophytes you destroyed. Now she doesn't do anything of the sort. She has 5 strength, boosts all of your other elves by 1 strength, and summons herself from your deck whenever you have 5 elves in play. So that's a really interesting effect, and does make you consider whether to overextend onto the board. For example, if you know you already won the round, you have to be really careful about playing your 5th elf, because you kind of don't want to overextend Illiren into a board you've already won. So that's really kind of interesting. We saw her come out on the stream on yesterday, and it looked like a really potent card. Of course, entirely different, but pretty good, I feel. One thing of note, of course, is that Commando Neophytes, as well as some other cards, I believe, have now been edited to include the elf tag, which, well, it was there. It wasn't really that relevant, but it was there. And now it's actually worth keeping an eye on. A small change that's worth pointing out, I feel, is that Barclay Els now also includes the strength of gold dwarf units. So Barclay Els gives all of your dwarves, wherever they are, +1 strength. And this now also applies to Zoltan and Zoltan Animal Tamer. And why is this worth pointing out? Because a number of other dwarf units have received a strength buff. So I won't really point them out here, but it's worth keeping in mind that you may see a bit more dwarfs on the ladder. And now the elephant in the room, I guess. Isengrim has been completely reworked. So the way Isengrim used to work is as the big finisher for the Gadgetzan control decks, where you play him and then he spawns a commando neophyte unit for every special card in your graveyard. He no longer does anything of the sort. Now you want to play him early, so he spawns 2 neophytes every time you play a special card. So the tactic completely changes, but definitely still a powerful card, and something to keep in mind. Of course, with the Illiren change, spamming the board with neophytes doesn't really matter as much as it did before, especially as you are playing against a Gadgetzan player. You don't really have to be scared of the neophytes blowing themselves up in your face anymore, but this can run out of hand rather quickly. It's kind of a snowball effect, and if your opponent gets too many neophytes on the board, that's definitely still something to be scared of. You could, of course, run some Stonewall Tremors here, but that might also deal some damage to your own board. So mileage may vary. We'll have to see how good the new Isengrim is. Definitely interesting. And that's it for the major card changes. Now let's take a quick look at what's coming next. Some new cards have been announced. I'm not going to repeat all of them. They are, of course, subject to change, but something that's worth mentioning is that a number of effects have been spoiled that either move your opponent's units or your own units into different rows, which is definitely interesting. It allows you to play around with weather, either by moving your opponent's units into weather, or moving your own units out of weather, gathering all of your units into one single row to make your commander's horns more effective, or your other buff effects, but might also make you more vulnerable to your opponent's removal. Also, some more interaction with gold cards has been announced, especially a card called Dimeridium's Shackles, which allows you to remove gold status or remove effects like Adrenaline Rush from either your opponent's minions or perhaps your own minions if negative status effects have been applied to them. We haven't really seen a lot of those, but a neutral effect that allows you to interact with gold units is definitely something worth keeping an eye on, in my opinion, and should definitely shake up the meta quite a bit. Another thing that has been in the pipelines for a while are premium cards. Now these are animated cards like the Gerald everyone has, and they can be crafted or they can be found in kegs. Crafting them, of course, costs more, basically like the Hearthstone model, where gold cards cost double of a normal card. But if you find them in a keg, they can also be scrapped for additional value. So you might definitely want to bling out your favorite deck by making all of the cards animated, and they're looking pretty sweet so far, so definitely also looking forward to them. I'm not really one to care too much about premium cards, but they're definitely there for the ones of you that care about such things. And furthermore, we're looking at a new ranked mode that is slated to be unlocked at a certain level, yet unknown what that level will be, and also includes seasonal awards for reaching a certain rank, includes global, regional, or local leaderboards, so you can compare your win ratio, your ranked performance with other people in the world, with your friends. Should definitely be exciting. The current XP system will be slightly revamped. I'm calling it a revamp, but it might not be exactly that. The main thing to take away from this here is that XP will be awarded for losing, and perhaps also for giving GG to your opponent. Might be a small amount, but might incentivize people that aren't really GGing to start doing so. They have announced that they won't be touching the daily reward system too much, perhaps just adding something onto it. Definitely looking forward to this, and this should help, especially the people on big losing streaks, to rank up a little bit and unlock those juicy kegs just a little bit faster. So overall, a lot of stuff to look forward to. Of course, these last few slides include stuff that won't be in the next batch, but more likely to be either later this month or perhaps early next year. And of course, there's also the final faction, Nilfgaard, to look forward to. So definitely a lot of exciting stuff on the horizon. Looking forward to it. And you will be seeing some more Gwent from me. Not entirely sure how much time I will have to make videos on that, but we'll definitely take a look at the next patch. And as always, have a great day, everyone. I will be back with some Hearthstone videos starting tomorrow, because the new extension for that one is out, so definitely come and take a look at that. have a great day, and I will see you next time.